In January of 2015, two Navy fighter jets pointed their targeting pods at something over the Atlantic, and what showed up on the screen made the pilots forget they were being recorded. This is the story of what that video actually shows, what happened to the warning that came attached to it, and why it took the United States government the better part of a decade to say anything about either one. It started with a routine radar upgrade. In 2014, Lieutenant Ryan Graves was flying A-18F Super Hornets out of Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach, with Strike Fighter Squadron 11, the Red Rippers. That year, the squadron's jets were fitted with a new radar system. Almost immediately, it began picking up objects that had no business being there. At first, the crews assumed it was a software problem. Then they cross-checked the radar hits against a second sensor, infrared, and the returns matched. Whatever the radar was seeing had a heat signature. It was physically there. Within months, it stopped being strange and started being routine. Pilots would walk into the pre-flight brief, glance at each other, and say some version of the same thing. "We're seeing one of those damn things again." It became part of the paperwork. Then it stopped being routine for one afternoon. Warning Area W72 sits about 10 miles east of Virginia Beach, and every jet entering it that day had to cross a single fixed point in the sky at a set altitude to get in. As two Super Hornets crossed that point during a training run, one of the pilots saw it directly ahead of them. A dark gray cube inside a clear sphere, sitting motionless against the wind, parked exactly on the entry point. The jets were 100 feet apart when they broke to avoid it. The mission ended right there. Both aircraft turned around and flew home. The squadron did what squadrons are trained to do after something like that. They filed a safety report, and Graves, describing it years later, put what happened next in 9 words. No official acknowledgement of the incident, and no further mechanism to report the sightings. The paperwork went in. Nothing came back. No one built a better way to log the next one. There would be a next one. 2 months into 2015, 2 more Super Hornet crews from the same strike group, now working up aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt, caught something on their targeting pods clearly enough to record it. 2 short video clips came out of that January. The Navy would eventually give them plain, almost clinical names: GIMBAL and GO FAST. In the first, the crew's infrared pod locks onto an object that appears to spin steadily in place as it crosses the sky, cold at the center, glowing at the edges. One pilot can be heard saying it out loud. "Look at that thing, dude." Someone else mentions a whole fleet of them, though only one is visible in frame. In the second video, an object skims low and fast over open water while the crew tries to figure out, in real time and on an open channel, what they are actually looking at. Skeptics have since pointed out that a good chunk of that spin in the first video can be explained by how the camera pod itself rotates when it tracks a target through a turn. A known optical quirk of the equipment, not necessarily the object. That explains the spin. It does not explain what the object was, why it showed no exhaust plume, or how it held position the way it did. The mundane explanation accounts for part of the video, not all of it. Graves, describing the broader pattern to Congress years later, put numbers to what the sensors were reading. The objects, he said, could accelerate to roughly the speed of sound, hold their position against hurricane-force winds, and stay up longer than any fighter jet's fuel would allow, operating continuously through the day. No visible means of lift, no control surfaces, nothing that resembled a wing, a flap, or an engine. "I am a formally trained engineer," he told the committee, "and I have no explanation for this." Later that same year, a warning about exactly this went up the chain of command, and it did not survive 24 hours. Tim Gallaudet, later a Rear Admiral, but at the time serving with Fleet Forces Command, had a classified email land in his inbox over the Navy's secure network. It came from his boss, the operations commander, addressed to every 1- and 2-star admiral in the chain. The subject line read, "Urgent Safety of Flight Issue." Attached to it was the Go Fast video. The email asked, plainly, if anyone recognized where the object had come from, and it flagged multiple near-mid-air collisions with unidentified objects in the exact stretch of airspace off Virginia Beach, where Graves' squadron had been flying. It raised the possibility of shutting the training exercise down entirely for safety. Gallaudet was not some outside observer. He had spent years as the Navy's own oceanographer and later ran a federal agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This was a career scientist and a 2-star admiral looking at his own service's video in a channel built for nothing but flight safety. He read it, he reviewed it with his deputy, and the next day the email was gone, pulled from his system and his deputy's system both. The group of admirals it had gone to kept meeting in person, routinely, exactly as before. Nobody ever brought it up again. Gallaudet has said publicly that he assumes it was pulled in connection with a classified program he wasn't read into. What he has also said on the record is simpler than that. He couldn't believe that an urgent safety of flight issue, once raised, was never discussed again. And after reviewing it, he has said plainly that he didn't believe the objects represented any known human technology. For 2 more years, that was where it stood. A pilot's report that went nowhere. An admiral's warning that vanished in a day. Then the press got there before the Navy did. In December of 2017, the New York Times broke the story of a secret $22.5 million Pentagon program that had spent years quietly studying reports like these and published a separate video from 2004 off the coast of California that came to be known as the Tic Tac. That story cracked the subject open publicly for the first time. It was not, however, the Roosevelt story. That came a year and a half later. The 2017 story existed at all because someone inside that program decided secrecy had gone too far. One of its own former investigators, a Pentagon official named Luis Elizondo, had resigned that October in a letter that argued the department wasn't taking its own findings seriously. He then went to reporters. It's a pattern that repeats through this entire story. The people closest to the evidence kept trying to push it upward, kept getting stopped, and eventually stopped going up the chain and started going to the press instead. In May of 2019, the Times published a second piece, this one built specifically around Graves and his squadron. It described objects seen almost daily from the summer of 2014 through March of 2015, with no visible engine, no exhaust plume, capable of reaching 30,000 feet and hypersonic speed, and maneuvering, in the pilot's own description, beyond the physical limits of a human crew. For the first time, Graves was named. For the first time, the Navy was asked, directly on the record, what it planned to do about any of this. 11 months after that, on April the 27th, 2020, the Department of Defense did something it had never formally done before. It released GIMBAL, GO FAST, and the 2004 Tic Tac video officially as authentic Navy recordings and confirmed what reporters had already pieced together. 2 of the 3 had been filmed in January of 2015 during workups aboard the Theodore Roosevelt off the American East Coast. The video was finally public. What followed took years, not days. In June of 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence published its own assessment. 144 reports going back to 2004, the overwhelming majority still unexplained. In July of 2022, the Pentagon stood up a permanent office to investigate them, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, built specifically because the old, informal channels, the ones that had swallowed Graves's safety report and Gallaudet's email without a trace, had never worked. By then, Graves had left the Navy and started his own answer to the problem his squadron ran into in 2014, no mechanism to report the sightings. In 2021, he founded Americans for Safe Aerospace, built to do the one thing the chain of command never had, take a report and actually keep it. Within 2 years, it had grown to nearly 5,000 members, and more than 30 military and commercial aircrew had come forward through it, most too afraid of professional consequences to speak publicly at all. One detail from that intake process stayed with him. Commercial pilots, trained professionals with decades in the air, would often open with an apology. I realize this will sound crazy, before describing an object at 40,000 feet, doing something a Starlink satellite flare couldn't do. This was not, by 2023, a curiosity with no stakes. In April of 2022, the Federal Aviation Administration quietly alerted its own operations managers that a commercial airliner over West Virginia had suffered a double attitude failure and a double autopilot failure while flying beneath an unidentified object. The government's own preliminary count, released in 2021, put the number of near-mid-air collisions with UAP at 11. Graves believes and has said publicly that the real number has only grown since. And on July the 26th, 2023, Ryan Graves sat down in front of the United States House of Representatives and said it himself, in person, under oath. It has been more than a decade since my squadron began witnessing advanced UAP demonstrating complex maneuvers on a regular basis, he told the committee, and we still don't have answers. He put a number on the silence, too. Sightings of UAPs in our airspace are not rare, he said, but they are grossly underreported. Even the government's own new investigators haven't fully closed the trust gap Graves is describing. The director of the Pentagon's UAP office has said publicly that eyewitness testimony isn't considered credible on its own, a standard that would have discounted Graves' own report in 2014, Gallaudet's own read of the email in 2015, and nearly everything in between. Nobody at that 2023 hearing claimed to know what the objects were. Nobody has to this day. What the record does show clearly, and in the government's own documents, is smaller than that, and in some ways, stranger. A pilot filed a report in 2014 and got nothing back. An admiral raised an alarm in 2015 and watched it disappear in a day. And the country that owned the video did not officially admit the video was real until 5 years, 2 newspaper stories, and 1 act of Congress later. The objects are still out there by every account since. What took a decade wasn't the sighting, it was the paperwork.